counterproliferation and counterterrorism, as we try to identify, and what was mentioned earlier on the panel, the incidence of plague in Africa, and whether or not the speculation could or could not be that that is an Al-Qaeda incident, Al-Qaeda-related incident. The Commission talked about needing a different approach and a creative approach to biological agents. It talked about the challenges in technology. Bio is a very easy to develop, while there are some technological challenges in some sophisticated biological agents, but it's also, as the old adage went, the poor man's weapon of mass destruction. The report talked about the continuum of prevention and preparedness and consequence management. So it recognized that the issue may not be purely intelligence, and it may not be purely security. It may not be purely a policing function to identify and deter. It also recognized the global nature of science, which I thought was extremely important, because those involved in bio-event and biological science are not necessarily those looking for some nefarious intent, but do have a lot of knowledge, and the spread of knowledge, especially with our internet capability today, the knowledge is out there for everyone. The report emphasized the soft approach and how to involve citizens, which I think is really important. But I have to say, when I looked at the report and the 12 recommendations, or 13 recommendations out of the report, 2 of them addressed bio, the domestic issues of bio and the international issues of bio. I think that's important. However, so much of biological terrorism is subliminal and insidious, and is very difficult, as you look at the issue, to detect whether it was a naturally occurring event or whether it was intentional. And I think many times, as you look at some of the events that we're aware of, we know that it takes sometimes years to be able to identify that it was, in fact, an intentional event. The Rezhnikis, in their Oregon incident of salmonella, it took a year before there was any awareness, documented awareness, that it was a biological incident intentionally perpetrated. I think that as we looked at the Commission's addressing these challenges, they identify how difficult it is, but still go back to the nuclear way of handling things. We looked at the high-tech issues and the science, the very difficult challenges, taking a look at DNA. Those are very important issues, but I would offer, too, that some of the lower-tech issues of biologicals are some of the most dangerous forms of terrorism that we have to deal with. There are many critical points of failure in identifying counterproliferation issues. Much like the internet, one small incident of not having something programmed appropriately and the whole program fails. I believe that in bioterrorism, more than anything else, that one critical incident, which can be relatively insignificant to most of us on the surface, as Fran mentioned, delivering our countermeasures, having them there when you need them. Very challenging problem, and in many of our exercises, we wish away the timeline that those countermeasures will be there in time. So I believe that there's a lot of issues that are underlying this issue of bioterrorism that we have to address.
Okay. Now, I think I'd like to ask Charles to go second. Strengths and weaknesses of the report.
What I found appealing about the report was a couple of things that just struck me. One was the emphasis on doing work on bioforensics. And let me preface this by saying that, you know, my optic into this field is largely through the window of my work in Iraq. I mean, I used to, my colleagues at CIA, I told them everything I know about management I learned from Saddam Hussein. Similarly, bear that in mind when you hear whatever it is I have to say. And the advantage of Saddam Hussein was he was, in his own way, kind of a rational actor, from his frame of reference. So he can be deterred, and to the extent that if you have somebody who you can assign responsibility for a particular WMD act, you can deter them. So that's by way of preface to say I appreciate the emphasis on bioforensics. So to the extent that we can develop a scientific, and we are known to have a way of finding out the return address on some of these events, that's a very useful thing. A second thing I found quite positive about the report was the emphasis on the geographic region of the Fatah region in Pakistan. This relates to a point that, I don't know, glibly stated, guns don't kill people, people kill people. The weapons and the techniques which we describe are presumably intended to have some goal. And in back of that goal is some group or person. So I think to the extent that we can focus on root causes, that's an area that I think will pay some dividends. In a similar point, there's a fault. What the report misses. There's a couple of things. One is it doesn't address, what is the objective? What are these people trying to achieve? And I think if you look at that, that may help you think about the responses. If you assume, for example, that somebody's trying to do damage to the American economic system, then that shapes how you may think about the preventative measures you want to take or the stockpiles and so forth. And I think, to the extent that we look at, who the actors are, what they're trying to achieve, that's a useful exercise. And I don't think the report really focused a lot on that. Secondly, and this came up in the first panel to a certain extent, I think, to overlook or to brush aside chemical weapons or radiological weapons is a mistake. I think it is pointed out in the report that biological weapons are good because they're easier to get than nuclear weapons, so that if somebody wants to do something bad, they won't do something really bad because it's easier to use biological weapons. Well, by the same logic, I guess I would say, chemical weapons are to biological weapons as biological weapons are to nuclear weapons. So, if you look at all that, the probabilities of something bad happening, to me at least, and again, this is driven by experience in Iraq, it's more likely you're going to see chemical weapons. And we did see that in Iraq, even after we had invaded. They were building and constructing chlorine weapons. And I think we should not ignore that, as that is probably the more likely event we're likely to face.
Thanks, Charles. Mike?
A couple thoughts, Judy, so we don't have too much time. My reaction report was, number one, I thought its strength was its weakness. Its strength was very comprehensive. And in a way, that's its weakness, because I kind of got lost in the recommendations. And I'm a much more practical person, and I look for things that can be done immediately without costing any money. And I actually believe in the counterterrorism business, most things that can be seriously done can be done right away with political courage, a little risk-taking, and without any additional funding. Most things in Washington, you can't even talk about doing them without a $10 billion budget assigned to it. And I get quickly bored with those types of suggestions, or anything that has to do with reorganizing the government. I also lose interest in. So I focus much more on the practical. And the way I look at this problem, and by the way, remember, whenever you talk about terrorism, I always try to remind people, number one, that terrorism is an instrument of the weak. And Al-Qaeda is a weak organization, and that's why they use weapons to kill innocents and civilians, because they don't have traditional means of power. And what they're really attacking is not your infrastructure or your army. They're attacking your psyche. They want you to have fear. So that you have to always understand, when dealing with the terrorism problem, is that you have to have a relentless focus on these people, because they're out to harm you, but never allow them to grip your fear. So when